Hi folks, hope you're enjoying and benefiting from our guitar lesson series. Remember, it's essential that you watch these lesson videos in order. Each lesson leads into the next, and you won't get the big picture if you skip any of the steps. Many of you have been searching for these answers for years. You might be tempted to jump ahead and look at lesson 24 because you're into the blues, but if you don't know your intervals and modes from lesson 12 and 17, you just ain't going to get it. Consider purchasing the 150-page official course handbook for $19.95 from our website at www.absolutelyunderstandguitar.com. You'll find that link multiple places here on our YouTube channel. Each of the 32 video lessons has a corresponding printable page that you can view to help with review and memorization. All of the charts and graphs I create in the videos are reprinted there. The package also includes our amazing chord, scale, and arpeggio encyclopedia containing most every useful finger pattern known to man. Reserve your copy today. If you like what you're learning here, tell all your friends and like and subscribe to our channel. So enjoy this lesson and continue on, and you will absolutely understand guitar. Hi, welcome back to Absolutely Understand Guitar. I'm your host, Scotty West. Today, we're going to finish up our discussion on chords and how to play, practice, and strum them. Then we're going on to talk about the musical number system, an alternative way for naming the 12 notes that will make it much easier to begin learning your chord and scale theory. This is lesson 7, so make sure you're looking at page 7 in your book. You'll also want to pull out your musical slide rule because we'll be using that today as well. All set? Here we go. Hi, welcome back. We've been talking about chords for the last couple of hours now, and I ran out of time last time. I just got a couple of more things I want to tell you about that. But remember, what we've been talking about chord-wise so far is first we learned some basic facts about how chords work and the basic fingerings for how to play them. That's all on this chart right here. Then the next thing we talked about after that was how to name your chords. Make sure you've got all that down, the three ways, the three parts of each chord name across the top up here. And what we're basically talking about now is how to actually articulate chords on the guitar, how to practice them. And we said one of your best allies is to have some kind of drum machine that you can practice with. And then we have this nice methodology down here. The best way to practice chords is practice them in pairs, because it's actually the switching and forming and reforming of the chord that you have to practice. Back and forth every 4 beats with your drum machine, slow as you need. We learned about how to actually put the drum machine on and speed up and slow down the tempo. 1, 2, 3. How to count along with a beat like this. And we talked about this methodology for practicing where you just strum on different parts of the beat, whole notes where you just strum on beat number 1. I'm sure you remember all this stuff. The next thing that we went on to after that is what I just want to talk a little bit more about today, which is this strumming business. We have talked a lot about what to do with your left hand when you're playing guitar, but we haven't talked an awful lot really about how to articulate these different chords when you actually play them on the guitar. What goes on with your right hand here. And this is what strumming is all about. And the first thing we said about strumming is you've got to make sure that you understand that basically when you're strumming 99% of the time, what you're really doing is you're just going back and forth with your hand very regularly with the beat. Like if the beat were going like this, I have to find what rate I have to strum at, and a kind of an average half beat rate would be kind of like this. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. I could also double time that. 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1E and a 2E and a 3E and a 4E and a 1 and 2. But notice how my hand just goes back and forth very regularly. Oops, I'm off the beat myself. Your hand goes back and forth very regularly, just like the pendulum on a clock. But then how do you avoid getting your strumming to be boring? Well, your hand may be going back and forth, as we mentioned last time, but you may not be hitting the strings every time. And each song you play has a particular strumming pattern. This is the first one I was trying to show you right down here. This is a very simple and common strumming pattern. Here's your beats. You're going 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and your hands going back and forth. 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and here actually is how you're actually going to articulate the strumming pattern. You're only going to hit certain beats. You're going to hit these downs where you see the letter D, and these upstrokes where you see the letter U, and these black dots are missed strokes. So out of this very regular back and forth, when I start to do the strumming pattern, it's down, down, up, up, down, up, down, down, up, down, up, down. See, my hand looks like I'm doing the same thing that I was before. It's just going back and forth. Down. But see how I'm getting this articulation in the beat? Long, short, long, short, 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 long, short, long, short, short, because I'm missing certain strokes. And, for example, I'll strum a chord now so you can really hear how this particular strumming pattern works. Down, down, up, down, up, down, down, up, down, up, down, down, up, down, up, down, down, up, miss, up, down, miss, down, up, miss, up, down, miss, down, up, miss, up, down, down, up, down. So there are a lot more strumming patterns than this. This just happens to be a very kind of common one that I'm just sort of using as an example. In a later tape, we'll probably go back to this again and learn a little more about strumming patterns and look at some other ones. You mostly, a lot of times, just pick up strumming patterns from playing songs. As long as you just remember that basically the best way to keep a steady beat is if your hand is not going like and then pausing, and then going again, and then stopping and going. Your hand is always just flowing along, down, up like that, and then you learn the particular pattern for each song that you play. Okay, cool. That finishes up that subject. The next thing we're going on to is a huge big deal here. I never quite understand why more teachers don't get their people to understand this concept right in the beginning. You know that in our pitch system in music, we have 12 notes, and we looked at one point at how the musical alphabet actually works with the sharps and flats and stuff in it, and that A sharp and B flat are the same note, and there's a couple of notes that don't have any sharps and flats between them, B and C and E and F, and we learned that alphabet because we're saying that music is a language, and a lot of these things like chords and scales that you're going to be playing are things that are, in a sense, very much like words, and they actually have spellings. And your guitar is your typewriter, and you simply have your fretboard where all of these different notes are delineated. If we could just look at this here for a second. This is a few lessons back now. Hopefully you've been reviewing all this stuff. This is your fretboard of your guitar, and you know your open strings are E, A, D, G, B, E, and then you've got your, through your chromatic scale on your guitar in alphabetical order with the sharps and flats going up each string. So on your A string here, your first fret is A sharp, B flat, and then B, and then C, and then C sharp, D flat, and then D, so on and so forth till you get up to your 12th fret, which is your octave fret where this whole system starts over again. So if that was the A string, your 12th fret on that string is also A, and then it just continues up from there. So in order to understand how to create chords and scales, which are very much like words in the language, obviously you have to understand the musical alphabet. And so make sure you've got, at this point now, particularly your whole alphabet system for naming the 12 notes down. What we're going to talk about today is a second system that humans have created over the centuries to assign names. Once again, here's a row of 13 little boxes down here. These represent the 12 different notes in our pitch system. And then remember, the 13th note is your octave note where everything begins over again. And what we're looking at today is an alternative system for assigning names to the 12 notes. And you already know about the alphabet system. What we're going to be looking at today is there is a way of numbering the notes, which makes it a lot easier to memorize your pitch patterns in the beginning and actually see how they work. And that's what I'm going to explain to you today. The first thing you got to understand is you might recall that I said that to understand basic popular music, there are about 50 different pitch patterns that you have to understand. About a third of them are chords, about a third of them are scales, and about a third of them are intervals. And they add up to 50. You've got 50 pitch patterns that you need to memorize. In the musical language, you've got 50 words that you need to learn how to spell out of that musical alphabet. Well, remember when I said there were 50 patterns you had to learn? Well, I lied. Not really, but what I mean is it's not quite that simple. What I meant was there are 50 basic pitch patterns in popular music. However, each one of those pitch patterns can be played in any key. Now, what does it mean for music to be played in a particular key? You might have heard of musicians talking about that. Somebody will yell out, "Hey, what key is this song in?" What does it actually mean for music to be in a key? Well, that's a complex issue that we're going to be approaching by degrees as we go through this entire program. But certainly one thing that we can say for now is this. Any given song you play has a bunch of different notes in it, right? They're all forming themselves horizontally into scales and melodies and stuff. They're all stacking on top of each other vertically to function as chords and harmony and stuff like that. So every song you play has a bunch of swirling notes in it. But one thing you would like to know is that somewhere in every song you play, every conventional song you play anyway, is one note that's acting as like the anchor for the whole song. I call it the nucleus note. Every song has a bunch of whirling notes in it, swirling around like the electrons around an atom or something. But right in the middle, there's always the nucleus too. There's one note that's acting as the anchor for the whole thing. Once you have identified which of the 12 notes is acting as that nucleus note, you know what key you're in. If D is acting as the nucleus note in that song, then you're playing the song in the key of D. There's a lot more, as I said, to know about what it means to play in a key, but that's enough for what we're talking about today. Some of you probably already know some different things about that, like maybe you've had some experience with key signatures in written music and stuff, and all that's important too, and we'll be getting to that later. But, so my question is this, if every song you play is in a particular key, how many different keys are there that you can play in? How many different choices do you have of which note is going to be that nucleus note? Well, the answer obviously is 12. So what that means is there are 12 different keys that you can play in when you play music. Now, later on, you're going to find out there's some other things like there's minor keys and there's modal music and stuff like that. But for right now, anyway, the best way to look at it is that there are actually 12 different keys that you can play in music. So when I said that you had 50 pitch patterns that you had to learn, what I meant was there are 50 different pitch patterns, but you need to be able to play all 50 of those in any one of 12 different keys. So the bad news, in a way, is that there aren't just 50 patterns you have to learn. There's actually 50 times 12, which is 600. That's a little bit of a larger number, isn't it? But again, even 600 is not a horribly bad number. Remember, this is a language, and you're talking about learning to spell words. Think of the English language. You know thousands and thousands of words in the English language. 600 words to master a language is not really that huge a number. And not only that, a lot of these words only have 2 letters in them. So they're words like it and do and be. And a lot of them only have 3 letters in them. So they're like cat and dog. A lot only have 4. A lot only have 5. So these are not huge words that you have to learn anyway. But the bad news is there are actually 600 of them. And, it's going to take you a while to learn all that stuff. You're going to be doing this for the next 5 years, getting all this stuff down. But here's the good news. There is a way for us to bring that number back from 600 down to 50 again. And I'll show you how that works. In music, you have these 50 different patterns that you have to learn. One of those patterns is, for example, a major chord. So a major chord is one of our 50 pitch patterns. But how many major chords are there? There are 12, because you can take a major chord pattern and you can play it in any one of the 12 keys, using any one of the 12 notes as your root note for that particular chord. So there are a major chord is one of your 50 pitch patterns, but there's actually 12 different major chords. And as we keep saying, these are very much like words in a language, and they actually have spellings. And now if we can zoom in here on the musical slide rule, you'll see what I mean. This has, on your slide rule here, you've really got about all 50 patterns on here. And let's talk about a major chord. Up in your upper corner here, on this chord that says, on the side that says chords and arpeggios, you'll know up in the upper left-hand corner here, it's labeled a major triad. Triads are very basic types of chords. They only have 3 notes in them, you'll notice. And each one of these 12 different major chords has a spelling. And, for example, right now I'm looking at an A major chord. So if you take your slide rule and up in the very upper left-hand corner where you see right under the word major, you see box number 1. If you put the letter A in there, then you are in the key of A. And you'll notice that that major chord has 2 other notes in it that show up in these other 2 boxes here. So, and if you can see that, and if you've got your slide rule lined up, you'll see A is in that window right there. You'll see C sharp is in that window right there. And E is in that window right there. That is the spelling, if you will, for an A major chord. Out of the 12 notes in your pitch system, A, C sharp, and E would be the 3 notes that you would play to make a major chord. Now, let's take a look at, and we know that there's 12 different major chords. So what would be the next major chord higher than an A major chord? Well, we would just take our slide rule and we'd kind of slide it up so that now A sharp, B flat is the next higher chord. And you'll notice that now all the letters have gone up 1. So B flat, D, and F is the spelling for a B flat major chord. And then if you slide this up again, then you're in the key of B. And you see that it's B, D sharp, and F sharp. If you slide it up again, you're in the key of C. The spelling for a C major chord is C, E, G. And then there's D flat, F, and A flat. So if you were going to memorize the spelling of all 12 major chords using the alphabet system for naming the notes, you would have 12 different sets of alphabet letters that you would have to memorize in order to memorize the spelling of all 12 major chords. You know, again, that's not such a big deal. There's only 3 notes in each set. But the point is, you would have to memorize, just to memorize your structure of a major chord, you would have to memorize the 12 different variations depending on which key you're playing in. Well, remember, what we're talking about today is this alternative system for naming the notes. And the beauty of that is that it treats music like there's only 1 key to play in instead of 12. And I'll show you what I mean by that. If we look at the slide rule again here. Yes, a major chord in each key of the 12 keys is going to have a different alphabet letter spelling. And so you've got 12 different variations that you have to memorize as you go through your 12 different keys like this. But let's do this. Let's take the slide rule and let's pull this middle thing right out of here all together so that we're just looking at this part of the slide rule here with no alphabet letters in any of the boxes at all here. Notice this. Yes, there are 12 different major chords, and each one of those 12 would have a different alphabet letter spelling. But another way to look at a major chord is by just looking at the slide rule here. You see some generalizations that you can make about a major chord. There are just 3 notes in a major chord out of the 12, and they're always spaced the same distance apart from one another out of the 12. So even though there are 12 different major chords, and they would each have a different alphabet letter spelling, another way to look at it is a major chord is a major chord is a major chord is a major chord. No matter what key you play it in, it always has the same basic structure within the 12-note system. It's always just 3 notes that are spaced a certain distance apart from one another out of the 12. So, wouldn't it be nice if we had an alternative system for assigning names to the 12 different notes in our pitch system down here that treated music as if there was only one key to play in? Then that would simplify everything a lot, wouldn't it? You'd be back to just having to learn your 50 basic patterns instead of the 600 where we take the 50 and look at its 12 different variants in the 12 different keys. Wouldn't it be nice if we had an alternative system for naming the notes where we could look at these basic structures of these patterns without having to resort to memorizing all 12 of the spellings for these? Well, we have such a system, and it's this thing called the musical number system. And some of you, or most of you, have already had a little bit of experience with how this number system works. For example, even a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about chords, you noticed that some of the chords that you play have numbers after them. There's like G7, and there's A6, and there's B flat 9. Maybe you've heard musicians talking about 1-4-5 progressions. You ever heard anybody talking about a 1-4-5 progression? Or you've heard them talking about major thirds or perfect fifths or something like that. These are people that are talking using this number system to talk about. So we need to figure out how that number system actually works. And here's my full question right here. You've heard of like C7 chords. What is that number 7 trying to tell us right there? You've heard musicians talking about a 1-4-5 progression. You've heard them talking about major thirds and perfect fifths and stuff. So in other words, you know that there is a musical number system at work in music. You know that the numbers are alphabetized in the alphabet system, but there's also a way that we numerize the 12 notes. There's actually a number system, and all this number system is it's an alternative way to assign names to the notes. So all you're doing is you're going to name the notes using a different system. But this system makes learning your pitch patterns 11 times easier. So it's 11 times easier to learn your pitch patterns by the numbers. Why? Because it treats music like there's only one key instead of 12. One universal key. But that won't do you very much good unless you know the answer to this question, which is, to what do these numbers correspond? Well, in a way, we've already answered this question, haven't we? To what do these numbers correspond? Well, we're suggesting that this is an alternative way of assigning names to the 12 notes in our pitch system. So we can begin to answer this question by simply saying that to what do these numbers correspond? Well, they number the notes in a way that's at least somewhat analogous to the way the alphabet system alphabetizes them. They number the notes. But they do it in kind of a screwy way. Let's take a look down here at the bottom of the page, and we have our 13 little boxes down here. Now, you saw me make these little boxes before when we filled in the alphabet letter names for the notes. And remember, this was A here, and the 13th note up here was also A, and we had all our notes along with our sharps and flats arrayed across the bottom of the page like that. Well, just like the alphabet system didn't go A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L. It had that slightly screwy, sharp, and flat thing going on. Another thing you want to realize is the number system doesn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. It'd be kind of nice if it did, but it just doesn't work that way. This first note right here will be note number 1. But this note up here, this 13th note up here, is not note number 13. In the musical number system, it's only note number 8. In fact, that's part of the reason why this distance is called an octave. An octave, O-C-T, being the prefix for 8. You know, we know there's 13 notes in an octave, but in this number system, the octave note up here only winds up being note number 8. So, how can that be? If we have 13 notes in our pitch system, why is that only note number 8? Well, that's because we haven't finished this answer up here. The actual whole answer to this is, and I'll write down the answer, then I'll work my way backwards to explaining how this thing works. They number the notes, but they do it in kind of a screwy way. They number the notes in A. This is a huge concept in music, so we're going to write it in big letters. They number the notes in what's known as a major diatonic scale. And I'll put the word diatonic in parentheses like that because sometimes that word is left out. A lot of you know this pattern already, but you know it as what's called the major scale. Now, this is the second scale that we've talked about in this program. Remember, the very first one we learned was a thing called a chromatic scale, and that was the very first thing when we learned how the guitar worked and you were using your 4 fingers and going up the frets and playing the whole 12-note system and learning how to do finger shifts and stuff like that. That was a chromatic scale. What we need to understand right now is a thing called a major scale or a major diatonic scale. Do you know what a major scale is? Most of you are going to say, no, I don't. But interestingly enough, actually you do know what a major scale is. You just didn't necessarily know that that's what it's called. A major diatonic scale is that very first pitch pattern that they tried to teach us way back in kindergarten, for example. A major scale is that thing that goes do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. You know that thing, right? Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. I bet you all know that pitch pattern. Well, this is do, right? Where we start. And this is also do up here at the top. So you can pretty much probably figure that those two are an octave apart from one another. And in fact, they are. And going do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do is the same as going 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. So, that being the octave note, that do up there, that's why in our musical number system, the octave note turns out to be note number 8. Because the only notes that get a whole number associated with them in the musical number system are the ones that are in this very, very important pattern, the major diatonic scale. The major scale is really the central pitch pattern in Western music, particularly in popular music. Now, some of you are going to heard other things like that. For example, the pentatonic scales are very important in Western music, which they are, but really in the end, they're nowhere near as significant as this thing called the major diatonic scale, no matter what key you're interested in. I mean, what style of music you're interested in. That's why they tried to teach it to you so young, but they usually don't do a very good job of explaining what that whole thing is all about. We need to, because how can this be? When we play a chromatic scale, we have all 13 notes in an octave, but when we play a major diatonic scale, we only have 8 notes. Well, obviously, to play a major scale, you don't play all the notes. You play some and you skip over some. And the interesting question is, though, how do you know which of the 13 notes to play and which of the notes to skip over when you play a major scale? You know, in other words, why are there only 8 notes in a major scale? One of the first common misconceptions that people have is they go, oh, I bet you left out all the sharp and flat notes. And I go, no, that's not exactly what it is. For example, watch up here on the keyboard. Does this sound like a major scale to you? Yes, it did, didn't it? That sounded like a major scale, and if you noticed, I played mostly black keys on the piano. So that major scale was almost completely made out of sharps and flats. So to have only 8 notes in it, it can't mean that I've left out the sharps and flats. Now watch this. Here's another major scale, starting on a different key, and this one will be all white keys. That was a do, re, mi scale. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That was made up of all white keys. Here's one that's about 50-50. If I start on this note right here. Wa, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do. That had 4 white keys and 4 black keys. So, when we play a major scale as opposed to a chromatic scale, it isn't that we leave out the sharp and flat notes. It's simply that we leave out certain notes. They aren't necessarily sharps or flats. That all just depends on which note you start on. But in order to really understand which notes to play and which to skip, there's a couple of huge words that we have to take our very first look at today. These are huge words. We're going to come back to talk about them a lot later on. But in order to understand this, we have to take a first look at them here. The very first word that we're going to write down, make sure we understand, is intervals. Sounds a little technical, doesn't it? I'm sure I've mentioned this word before. Intervals might be the most important word in all of music theory, interestingly enough. Now, you remember that I say ear training is the most important word in all of music, but specifically under the subject of music theory, intervals may be the most important word that you have to understand. What is an interval? Well, remember a few minutes ago when we were looking at the slide rule here, and we actually pulled the slide out of the slide rule, and we said, yes, a major chord is a major chord is a major chord. No matter what key you play it in, it's always 3 notes that are separated a particular distance apart from one another out of the 12. Well, a certain distance apart from one another. A very interesting thing to realize about music is, in many ways, the important thing is not so much what notes you play, because that's going to change depending on what key you're playing in. But one thing that never changes is the actual spacing of the notes. And those are what intervals are. The actual distances between the notes are what intervals are. And this is where music is a little different than some of the other languages you would speak. For example, in English, it isn't the distances between the letters that's important, or the distances between the words, but in music it actually is. That's the important thing. Music is a lot about spatial relationships within the 12. So we play a note, and then we skip some notes, and then we play another note, and then we skip some other notes. Notice that these 3 are not the same distance apart. These 2 right here are a little bit closer together than these 2 are right here. And so this is a larger interval between these 2 notes, and this is a smaller interval. Now, intervals being the most important word in music theory, we're going to spend close to 2 hours talking about intervals in the future, just a few hours from now. But for right now, there's only a little bit you have to know about intervals. Intervals, well, let's define it, is the pitch distance between any 2 notes. It's the pitch distance between any 2 notes. So if we look up at the keyboard for a second, you can see, well, like here would be an interval. You know, this is a pretty large interval. These notes are spaced pretty far apart from one another. Here's a small interval. If I play a note and then the note right next to it, that's a very small distance between the notes. Here's the next larger one. Now I'm skipping the black key and I'm going from this white key, and then here would be the next one. This is a little larger. Intervals can get very big. Here's a large interval right here. And they can go all the way down to these little tiny ones like that. We're going to be looking at intervals in depth in a while, but for now, The only intervals that you need to understand about for today's discussion are that very small one that we mentioned a minute ago. When you go from one note to the note right next to it, no matter what color it is on the piano, like here's two white ones that are right next to each other. That's E and F right there. What do you call it? What interval is it when you go from one note to the note right next to it? Do you know the answer to that? Have you ever talked about this with other folks? That is an interval called a half step. Might be a familiar term to some of you. When you go from one note to the note right next to it, that's a half step. If you play a note and then you skip a note and play the next note after that, see, I skipped that black key in between these two white keys. That's what's known as a whole step. So half steps and whole steps, very important intervals in music. Of course, the only other interval you might want to know about for today is this one. That's a larger interval, isn't it? What interval is that? That's an octave. See, I'm going from this C up to all through all the other 11 notes, and I'm landing on this next C up there. That's a distance called an octave, as I'm sure you know. An octave is an interval. And it just happens to be a larger interval than the small ones like half steps and whole steps. Okay, so for now anyway, that's all you need to know about intervals. It's the distances between the notes, which turns out to be a hugely important concept in music. Next word that we have to learn about is, after all, today, right now, we're talking about the major diatonic scale, right? And before today, we talked about the chromatic scale. There's also dozens of other types of scales, too. So I guess we better once and for all figure out what a scale actually is. The other word we have to define today is, what is a scale? Now, a lot of people think they know what a scale is. If I'd asked you what you thought a scale was, you might have said something like, well, a scale is when I take a bunch of notes and I play them all in a sequence. And I go, well, okay, that's a pretty good definition of what a scale is. But interestingly enough, if you're not using the word intervals as part of your definition of what a scale is, you're not exactly seeing the whole picture. Yes, a scale is a sequence of notes. That's true. But that's only half the definition. If you're not using the word intervals as part of your definition of what a scale is, you're not seeing the whole picture. Yes, a scale is a sequence of notes, but it's a sequence of notes separated by specific intervals. And what intervals are scales mostly made up of? Well, you'll come to find out that scales are mostly made up of either half steps or whole steps, or a combination of both of them. Most of the scales that we play are combinations of half steps and whole steps in very specific arrangements, in very specific order. Now, remember, the other scale we talked about before today was the chromatic scale. Now, before today, if I'd asked you, okay, what is a chromatic scale? You might have said something like, well, it's when you play all of the 12 notes, one after another in a sequence. And I go, okay, well, that's a pretty good definition of what a chromatic scale is. But now tell me something about what a chromatic scale is from the point of view of intervals. Yes, it's the 12 different notes in our pitch system, but how far apart? Remember, it's the spacing. How far apart from one another are the notes in a chromatic scale? And the answer, hopefully you know the answer to that, is all of the notes in a chromatic scale are always a half step apart from one another. Remember, B and C and E and F on your piano don't have any black key in between them, but that doesn't mean that they're a whole step. B and C and E and F are only a half step apart. So all of the notes in your 12-note pitch system are all separated by half steps. So as much as a chromatic scale is a sequence of 13 notes in the octave, it's almost more significant to think of a chromatic scale as being a sequence of 12 half steps, because it's the spacing that's really the thing. Well, we're not talking about the chromatic scale today. We're actually talking about the major diatonic scale, which doesn't have all 12 notes in it, all 13 in the octave. It only has 8 notes. So, and as we're saying, we are skipping over certain of the notes. And what you will begin to see is wherever you skip a note, that must be where a whole step is occurring within the sequence of intervals that make up this scale. And so what it is to know a particular scale is, again, not necessarily right away anyway to know exactly what alphabet letter notes are in it, but to know what the spacing of the notes are. And the scale we're talking about today is a major diatonic scale. Let's see what pattern of intervals that is. Obviously, it can't be all half steps because there would be 13 notes instead of 8. If you think about it, it can't possibly be all whole steps either, because if there's 12 half steps in an octave, that means that there would be 6 whole steps, and that means that the octave note up here would actually only be note number 7. It wouldn't be note number 8 like this. So that should tell you that a major scale is actually a combination of whole steps and half steps in a very specific order, and you have to memorize this. This is your next really big fact that you've got to make sure you've got memorized. What, after all, is the pattern of intervals for a major scale? A major scale, which is the scale that we use to measure all the other ones by, is very simple. A major scale is mostly whole steps. Most of the notes in a major scale are separated by whole steps. Mostly whole steps. But there are 2 very specific half steps in a major diatonic scale, and what you want to know is where they fall within the sequence. A major scale is mostly whole steps, except between, and this is the part you have to memorize, except between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. These are where the half steps occur. These notes in the sequence are only a half step apart. When we look back up here again, you might notice that I actually wrote those closer together. See how 3 and 4 are closer together and how 7 and 8 are closer together? These 2 notes within the major diatonic scale are a half step apart. They're as close together as can be. They're going to, for example, be consecutive notes on the keyboard, or if we can look at the guitar here for a second, half steps are played on your guitar by simply going from one fret to the next fret right after it. That's always going to be a half step. Now, if I want to play a whole step on the guitar, I play a note, and then I skip a fret, and then I go to the next note above that. So that's a half step, and that's a whole step, I'm sorry. That's a whole step by skipping a fret, and that's a half step when I go just from one note to the note right next to it. So a major scale is a very specific pattern of half steps and whole steps. It's mostly whole steps except between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8, which we've drawn these boxes around it up here at this point. What that must mean is that there is another note in between note number 1 and note number 2. There's another note in between there. When we play a chromatic scale, we play that note. However, when we play a major diatonic scale, we actually skip that note. There must also be another note in between note number 2 and note number 3. When we play a chromatic scale, which are all half steps, we would play that note, but in a major diatonic scale, we skip that note. Now, the next 2 notes, 3 and 4, are right next to each other. They're going to be consecutive frets on your guitar, consecutive keys on the piano. However, between 4 and 5, there's another note. Between 5 and 6, there's another note, because these are where the whole steps are. And then between 6 and 7, there's another note. Now, if I add up all the notes that I play in a major scale plus the black dots that I skip over, that's going to equal 13. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13. So there's your chromatic octave right there. And that's how a chromatic scale would be structured with all its half steps. But to play a major scale, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do, That's actually a very specific sequence of intervals, whole steps between most of the notes and half steps between the third and fourth and seventh and eighth note. Now that surprises a lot of people. I can walk up to people and I can go, you know that thing that goes do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do? Everybody goes, yeah. I go, do you think all of those notes are the same distance apart from one another? And most people go, well, nobody ever told me that they weren't different distances apart from one another. So yes, I think all those notes are the same distance apart from one another. Surprise, that's the wrong answer. Eventually your ear will be good enough that you can actually hear these subtle distinctions between half steps and whole steps. You will then you'll be able to tell that a major scale is that particular pattern of intervals. I'll show you another way that I can prove that's the pattern of intervals for a major scale. Let's take a look at the guitar here again. Now, I can start anywhere on the neck of the guitar with any particular note, and I think I'll just, at random, I'll pick this note right here. That's that note right there. Let's call that do. Do. Now, if I want to generate that pattern of sound that sounds like that do, re, mi scale, I have to make sure that I follow that interval pattern, which is a whole step from 1 to 2, a whole step from 2 to 3, but then a half step between 3 and 4, and a whole step from 4 to 5, a whole step from 5 to 6, whole step from 6 to 7, and then a half step from 7 to 8. Now, the only way I'll be able to generate that pattern of sounds is if that's the pattern of intervals I play on here. So if this is do right here, whoops, 1, then 2 has to be right here, because that's a whole step above the other note that I played. Here's 1. Here's 2, that's do, re, and here's the missing note in between. I skipped that fret. 1, whole step to 2, whole step to 3, do, re, mi, but now it's a half step. Fa, 3, 4, 3, 4. 3 and 4 in a major scale are only a half step apart. So we go 1, do, re, 2, 3, and then 4, and then after that a whole step to 5, and then a whole step to 6, and then a whole step to 7, and then finally a half step to 8. And these 7 and 8, oops, are only a half step apart, if you can see that. So here's the whole scale. 1, whole step to 2, whole step to 3, half step to 4, whole step to 5, whole step to 6, whole step to 7, half step to 8. Now, I could have played that anywhere on the neck of the guitar, and that would have been a major scale. I could start here and do whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, and that would be a major scale. And remember, a major scale is another one of our 50 pitch patterns we have to learn. But remember, there would be 12 actual different major scales, depending on which of the 12 alphabet letter keys you're going to play it in. And they would all have the same pattern of intervals, no matter what key you play them in. Whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Or in other words, mostly whole steps except between 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. Now, we have dozens of other scales that we use in the Western world and all over the planet, in fact. Different scales from Japan or China or Africa or anywhere. But this is the major diatonic scale is the central pitch pattern in Western music. The chromatic scale is sort of like the alphabet of music. The major diatonic scale is kind of like your most common and important word over there. We can begin. Now, what we're trying to do is fill in number names for all of the 13 notes that we have in our pitch system. We can begin to transfer some of this information up here, from up here to down here. For example, this is do. This is note number 1. But remember, it's a whole step to note number 2. So down here, this is not note number 2. That's just a half step of 1. This would be the note right here. That's note number 2. And here's that skipped half step in between. You also remember that it's a whole step from 2 to 3. So this is not note number 3 here. This is note number 3. But in a major scale, 3, which is the pattern that we use to measure all the other ones by, 4 is only a half step above 3, so it would be in the very next box right down here. 3, 4. Then we know we have a whole step to 5, and then another whole step to 6, and another whole step to 7, and then a half step to 8. That's how the musical number system works. It doesn't have a whole number associated to each one of our 13 notes. It only assigns whole numbers to the notes that are actually in that most famous and important pitch pattern of all, the major diatonic scale. It's the one we use to measure all the other ones by. It's the central pitch pattern in Western music. So when they decided to come up with this number system that makes it 11 times easier to learn your patterns because it treats music like there's only one key to play in, they said, well, how should we make this number system work? Well, since this is the scale that we use the most often, in the chromatic scale, you don't really play an awful lot. It's more like the alphabet of music. It isn't really a pitch pattern that you find yourself doing an awful lot with. This is the scale that you really use on a day-to-day basis in all of the songs you play. So they decided to have the number system work off of this scale instead. There's only one more thing, or a couple other things you got to know about the number system. For example, you see this note right here, and it would be either that note here or down on this scale down here, it'd be that note right there. Now, that is one of those notes that you skipped over to play a major scale. Well, just because this note is not in a major scale and therefore is not privileged enough to have a whole number associated with it, that doesn't mean that it's some weird, scary, useless pattern. That note right there is one of the most important notes in all of music. It's not in a major scale, but it's still a hugely important note. So it would be a pretty lame-o musical number system if we didn't have some way to assign numbers to the notes that aren't in the major scale. You know, in the alphabet system, we had a different alphabet for each one of the letter for each one of the 12 notes, you know, with the sharps and flats and all that stuff. So, what if I wanted you to play this note right here, this note that's halfway in between note number 2 and note number 3? What number note would I tell you to play? It's halfway in between note number 2 and note number 3. What number note would I have you play? A lot of people go, 2.5? And I go, well, that's not a bad way of thinking about it, because after all, it is exactly halfway in between note number 2 and note number 3. However, that's just not quite the terminology that we use to describe these notes. But you will be comforted to know that you already know something about the terminology that we do use, because what we do to assign names to the in-between numbers is exactly the same thing that we do to talk about the in-between alphabet letters in the alphabet system. That is, we sharp or flat them. So if I wanted you to play that note right there that's halfway in between note number 2 and note number 3, I'd tell you to either play a sharp 2 or a flat 3. Just like A sharp and B flat are the same note, sharp 2 and flat 3 are the same note, and they are that note that's halfway in between note number 2 and note number 3. Sharp 2, flat 3. Now, of course, that makes this note over here sharp 1 or flat 2. There is no sharp and flat number in between 3 and 4. Just like in the alphabet system, there's no sharp and flat letter between B and C. However, this next note over here, which is halfway in between 4 and 5, sometimes we call it a sharp 4, sometimes we call it a flat 5. The specifics of when to use one name and when to use the other aren't important for right now. The next note above that is sharp 5, flat 6. And the next note above that is sharp 6, flat 7. And then once again, 7 and 8 are right next to each other because they're just a half step apart. That's how your musical number system works. A lot of people are terribly confused about this, about how it works. And oftentimes it's because they just don't understand the chromatic scale to begin with. Other times it's simply because that nobody ever really explained to them what a major scale was, that it's a very specific pattern within the chromatic scale. And now that you understand the number system, you can begin to soak up the spellings, if you will. It's kind of odd to suggest that we're going to spell something using numbers, but that's actually what you do in music. You spell things using numbers in this number system. Remember a while back with the slide rule, we were talking about a major chord as one of our 50 different pitch patterns that we learned, and we said, and it's up right up here in the upper left on the side of your slide rule where there's chords and arpeggios. Now, again, I've got this set up so that A, C sharp, and E are the three notes that show up in the three windows. That's the spelling for an A major chord. And if I wanted to play a B flat major chord, I would just move everything up one. So now it's B flat, D, and F. And if I move it up again, it's B, D sharp, and F sharp. And if I move it again, it's C, E, and G. I'm going through my 12 different major chords that I have to memorize. In the alphabet system, I would have to memorize all of those alphabet letters as I moved this each time and looked at the 12 different keys. I'd have to memorize that a D major chord is D, F sharp, and A. But again, now if I do this, if I just pull this middle thing right out of the slide rule all together, and I just look at this, I can see, as we mentioned before, that a major chord is always three notes that are spread the same distance apart from one another, essentially out of the 12 notes in our pitch system down here. And if you look really carefully, underneath each one of these open little boxes here, you see a number. Once we've removed the center section of the slide rule from the slide rule, all that's left on this whole thing right here is numbers. And so there are 12 different major chords, but in the number system they would always be spelled using the numbers the same way. A major chord, no matter what key you play it in, is always 1, it's note number 1 in the key, 3, and 5. The numeric spelling for a major chord is 1, 3, 5. And so no matter which of the 12 keys you play a major chord in, it's always going to have that same number spelling. So you're saying to yourself, gee, I'd like to know what notes are in an E flat major chord. Well, all I do is set the slide rule up so that I'm looking at my major triad. I put E flat in the first window right there, and I find that the spelling for an E flat major chord alphabetically is E flat, G, and B flat. And that's 1, 3, 5 in the key of E flat. If I want to look at what an F major chord is, I just slide this over. So now I'm looking at what 1, 3, and 5 would be in the key of F, with F as the first number up there, and that's F, A, C. The cool thing about that is, if you know your fretboard of your guitar, then if you can just figure out what the spelling is for any particular pitch pattern or chord that you want to play, you could actually figure out for yourself where to actually put your fingers on the neck of the guitar in order to actually be able to play that. How do you like that? That would be pretty good. You wouldn't have to buy books. Well, you'll probably want to do that anyway. But you wouldn't necessarily have to have somebody show you how to play all of these different patterns. You could kind of figure it out for yourself. Now, and that's a lot like, if you, again, the guitar is the typewriter in the language of music. And as we've said many times before, no one ever actually had to teach you how to type the word apple, did they? You knew how your typewriter worked, and you knew how the word apple was spelled, so it was easy for you to go, oh, apple, A-P-P-L-E. You figured out the spelling for that. Same thing's going to go on with your guitar. If you know how the pattern is spelled, and the first way to understand it is as a pattern of numbers. In this case, a major chord. A major chord is always 1, 3, 5. And look how far apart 1 and 3 are spaced. There's several different notes in between note number 1 and note number 3, and then 5 is you skip 2 more notes to get up to number 5. All of your 50 pitch patterns are actually on this slide rule. And now that you understand the number system, you can begin to look at them. For example, look at all the numbers on your slide rule. You see 6s, you see 7s, you see 4s, and also you see sharp and flat numbers. Like here's a flat 3, and over here is a flat 7, and here's a flat 5. So all of these sharp and flat numbers are also represented in these different pitch patterns. Now, there's one other thing you need to know about the musical number system you might have seen these already before. Remember, you've probably seen chords like 9 chords and 11 chords and 13 chords. And we'll tell you a little bit more about that next time. We're out of time for now, but we'll plug it in at the beginning of the next lesson. Where do you find notes? Well, let me just show you this one thing. Like, for example, note number 9 is just up in the next octave. It's the same as 2. And I'll tell you more about that next time. Anyway, we're out of time for now. So, keep reviewing your past material. Next week we're gonna finish up the musical number system, and then we'll be on to some other really interesting stuff. Until then, just keep practicing, and we'll see you next time. Okay? Thanks. Bye.